Summer in Australia means trips to the beach, long days in the sunshine, and family holidays. But when weather turns bad and natural disasters threaten, paradise can quickly become a nightmare. Over the next hour, you'll see ships in peril and sailors under attack, terrifying winds and raging seas, unbelievable rescues and cities wiped off the map. On Savage Australia, Storm. Every year, more than 5,000 cubic kilometres of rain fall to Earth. It nourishes and feeds the planet. Winds sweep the globe, carrying with them the rains and life-regenerating spores and seeds. But in their extreme forms, these elements can take lives, destroy property, and cause suffering on an enormous scale. In Australia, tropical cyclones, east coast lows, and supercell storms are a regular part of the weather pattern. They can all be deadly, and they're getting more severe.
Global warming already appears to be having an impact. What we expect to see is more intense tropical cyclones occurring, more Category 4s and more Category 5s, and in some ocean basins, a higher number of tropical cyclones.
So what is a cyclone, and why is Australia in the firing line? Cyclones are born in warm seas near the equator. Tropical waters across the top of the country, from Western Australia to Queensland, are ideal cyclone breeding grounds. Warm, moist air rises rapidly and forms massive thunderclouds, leaving areas of low pressure in its wake.
Once the circulation begins to occur, we have air rushing in at ground surface, and if the upper atmospheric conditions are conducive, then that air will flow outwards. It's almost like a vacuum cleaner in the sky. You need to have one end where it's sucking the air in and one end where the air is moving outwards.
The severity of cyclones in Australia is measured by categories from 1 to 5, essentially determined by the wind speeds.
Generally, a Category 1 cyclone will have wind gusts around about 100 to 125 kilometres an hour. We have various other categories, 2s, 3s and 4s, right up to Category 5 cyclones, which will have wind gusts in excess of around about 285 kilometres an hour.
Darwin is a thriving city with a population of about 12,500. On a Saturday morning, it's alive with shoppers. Informality and friendliness are typical of Darwin.
Situated at the very top end of the country, Darwin's unique character was a product of its remoteness and relative isolation. And its far northern location made it a prime target for Japanese bombers in World War II, giving Darwin its first taste of disaster. 30 years later, on the morning of Christmas Eve 1974, a relatively small tropical cyclone called Tracy was tracking safely past Bathurst Island.
Darwin's not a very easy place to hit with a tropical cyclone because you have Coburg Peninsula to the sort of north and northeast, where a cyclone has to basically miss Coburg Peninsula and then make a sharp turn to come back in towards Darwin, which is exactly what Tracy did.
This freakish behaviour put Darwin right in her sights. A dangerously intense cyclone was bearing down on an unprepared town.
The Bureau was putting out a lot of warnings, but people were a bit lax at the time. They didn't take heed, and they were impacted by a very, very severe cyclone.
A cyclone is imminent. A cyclone is imminent.
As Christmas Eve ticked over to Christmas Day, she unleashed her fury. At 3 a.m, the airport recorded 217 km/h winds before the instruments failed.
We don't know exactly how strong it was because the Bureau's anemometer was blown down and the winds were probably much stronger. This was a very, very severe, one of the most severe tropical cyclones to hit anywhere in Australia.
December 25th, 1974 was a Christmas day like no other for the residents of Darwin. In just one night, their hometown had been virtually wiped off the map.
The full extent of the damage to Darwin is very, very hard to comprehend. And everywhere the scene is like this. Streets littered with debris, houses crumbled, trees blown over. Huge steel girders which make up the telegraph poles have been bent.
For the survivors, it was a night that changed their lives forever.
I've never experienced anything like it in my lifetime. We thought it was the end. We thought it was the end. I did anyway. I thought, well, this is the end. We won't get over this.
Yeah, all gravel and wind burned from there up to there because I lost all my clothes.
She was pretty rough though. People just lost everything, you know. There's just nothing standing in the place.
Experienced an earthquake in Japan in 1946, but this was far more terrifying because it went on for about 3 hours.
In my area in the northern suburbs, there's not a house really livable in.
Oh, well, nobody have a Christmas dinner. Only thing they have is hard time, that's all.
You could hear nothing. It was just a continual roar and people screaming and things banging around, that sort of thing. And we all had to try and converge and get into this room, as I told you. Well, it was a bit of a battle to do that, picking up small children and that sort of thing. And in the dark, no electricity, only torches and candles that could get.
And the whole house seemed to explode and there was just nothing left.
And the floorboards collapsed and we were sucked out 30 feet down and 30 feet out. And I rolled on top of my baby. And he's all right now, and my husband grabbed him and ran to a car.
There's nothing wrong with me at all. I've only lost an eye, and that's nothing compared to legs and arms and speech, and, you know, I'm not blind completely.
Well, what were your thoughts in the middle of the cyclone?
I was scared to death. I thought I was going to die.
The death toll was always going to be terrible, but on that Christmas day, the full extent of the horror was still not known.
This, believe it or not, is an entire house. There's a young boy missing from this home. Police fear that he could be somewhere in there still. Everywhere around here there have been people injured. The number of injured is incalculable. Just a couple of 100 yards away from here, a man died.
As the search for bodies began, survivors faced the heartbreaking task of cleaning up. Meanwhile, health concerns escalated, with light planes spraying disinfectant over the rubble. As another precaution to prevent disease, residents were even asked to give up their pets to be put down.
You must be very sad to be saying goodbye to the old dog.
That's right. Now, with this possibility of the disease, it's permitted to depart with him. Yes, a bit more than I can take.
The annual Sydney to Hobart yacht race has been an institution since 1945. It's one of the top 3 ocean racing events in the world. In perfect conditions, it's a couple of days of smooth sailing. But when the wind gods turn nasty, it's a hair-raising ride that tests boats and crews to their limits. But none of the competitors would have been prepared for what 2001's race threw at them. The maxi yachts Nicorette and Wild Thing were battling rough conditions off the New South Wales south coast when a massive waterspout formed right in front of them. As winds and hail shredded Nicorette's mainsail, the crew huddled below, hoping for the best. Meanwhile, Wild Thing's luck held out, but it didn't last long.
And we just thought we'd made it, but we couldn't believe it when it hooked back and got us.
With its mast gone, Wild Thing limped back to Sydney, race over, thanks to a one-of-a-kind twister. But perhaps the mother of all twisters to hit the mainland was this one, which struck northern New South Wales in 2010. Residents of Lennox Head were amazed when a 100-metre wide waterspout appeared just off the coast, But their amazement turned to fear as it closed in. When the twister hit the town, it destroyed bus shelters, ripped off metal sheets and sent them flying. Nothing in its narrow path was spared.
Waterspouts aren't necessarily confined to thunderstorms, but they will often be associated with storms. They typically form in the Australian region over the sea, and they can move on to the land, like the Lennox Head example.
The hit-and-run tornado turned a seaside resort town into a disaster zone. It destroyed 12 homes and knocked out power to 500 others. 2 people were injured, but miraculously, no one was killed. After Darwin in 1974, when 71 people died and an entire city was virtually wiped out, Tracy was the benchmark by which Australians measured cyclones. Over the next 2 decades, scores of severe tropical cyclones hit the coastline. None could match Tracy's legacy of devastation and tragedy. The Australian coastline is vast, rugged and diverse, containing many of the nation's most iconic environmental features, from the Great Barrier Reef to tropical mangrove forests and the famous Bondi Beach. For millennia, storms and tropical cyclones have been smashing into the country's shorelines, relentlessly sculpting its unique beauty. Long before modern forecasting, Indigenous Australians carefully watched the size of coastal waves as a way of predicting an incoming tropical cyclone. When the first settlers arrived and towns and cities developed, the impact of cyclones increased dramatically. Reports from ships at sea provided only minimal warning.
In terms of the early forecasting prior to the satellite and radar era, then really we relied upon observations either from ships or from remote locations, and people would be able to tell us that a cyclone was approaching or it passed by or crossed the coast nearby to them. Reports were less frequent in those days compared to the time period now, but nonetheless we still have some good information about cyclones in the early 1900s and late 1800s for our region.
It wasn't until the 1960s that weather forecasters finally had the satellite technology to detect and track powerful systems.
It's a classical picture of a cyclone. It shows the eye of the cyclone very clearly, and also the spiral bands associated with the tremendous wind fields. In this particular cyclone, we've got winds of more than 100 miles an hour.
Although it took another 10 years for continuous monitoring right across the top end of Australia. We've come a long way since the early days of weather forecasting. These days, supercomputers and sophisticated programs allow the Bureau of Meteorology to pick up bands of low atmospheric pressure as soon as they form off the coast of Africa or far off in the Polynesian islands. Combining these observations creates an accurate early warning picture of what's coming. The latest in radar technology takes the guesswork out of weather forecasting. Previously, it only sent out horizontal pulses and could only detect rain. Now, it shoots out horizontal and vertical pulses and can tell the difference between rain, hail and snow.
We've got a pretty good idea these days of where a cyclone is going to form and where it's likely to track to and what part of the coast it will cross, and also at roughly what intensity that cyclone will be.
It's not just far northern Australia that is affected by dangerous weather events. Further south towards New South Wales, there lurks the dreaded East Coast Low.
East Coast lows are technically a cyclone, but not a tropical cyclone. They tend to occur off the east coast of New South Wales or very southern part of Queensland. They can actually look like a tropical cyclone on radar and satellite imagery. And sometimes people do get confused and think that they are a tropical cyclone. But the main difference is that they're not warm-cored and they don't have an eye to them. Yet they can also produce very, very strong winds, equivalent to a Category 1 or Category 2 tropical cyclone, as well as bring a lot of rainfall and large waves onto the coast, which can cause a lot of beach erosion and coastal recession.
And the incredible power of these systems has claimed some prize victims over the years. The city of Newcastle in the 1970s was a thriving industrial harbour, with hundreds of ships literally lining up to transport cargo of coal and steel throughout the world. It was the 25th of May, 1974. An east coast low was lashing the New South Wales coast, with gale force winds and heavy seas. Newcastle reported swells of more than 17 metres and winds of 160 kilometres per hour. The giant Norwegian bulk carrier Signa was anchored 4 kilometres offshore when the storm hit. The captain, ignoring warnings, headed to sea. The ship dragged anchor and ran aground off Stockton Beach.
She lies, broken-backed, beyond all hope of salvage, a mere 100 yards off the shore.
28 crew members were airlifted off, but because of concerns over salvage rights, the skipper and engineer wanted to reboard the ship, so lifesavers risked their lives by ferrying them back to the Signa in dangerous seas. In the days after, the waves took their toll on the wreck.
Well, the Signa saga has taken another very dramatic turn this morning when the ship actually broke in two.
Its bow section was towed away, and what remains of the stern still lies rusting away. In 2007, a deadly east coast low claimed another ship when the Pasha Bolka ran aground, threatening an environmental disaster. Early on the morning of June 8th, the Newcastle Port Corporation radioed the 56 ships waiting off the coast and warned them to move out to sea. The Pasha Bolka was one of the last to do so, and by the time the storm hit, the bulk carrier was unable to clear the coast and found itself in terrible trouble. It struck a sandbank at Newcastle Beach with waves of 17 metres crashing against the ship, forcing it closer to the shore. With fears growing that she was beginning to buckle, the crew had to be rescued before it was too late. In terrifying conditions, the chopper struggled to keep level in the howling winds of 70 to 80 kilometres per hour. Waves lashed the ship, and water combined with leaking oil meant the deck was dangerously slippery. One at a time, the 22 crew members were winched to safety, the steel cable twisting in the winds and static electricity giving rescuers a jolt every time they touched down. Remarkably, all were unhurt.
Worst conditions I've ever been in, like.
2 weeks later, as the weather eased, authorities were trying to figure out how to get the Pasha Bolka, now Newcastle's #1 tourist attraction, off the sand. The idea was for the Pasha to winch itself off by cables attached to 3 giant anchors, with assistance from some big super tugs. At a high tide in the middle of the night, the plan was executed to perfection.
See you later, Pasha. Bye. Just lost our tourist attraction. What are we going to do?
With the Pasha Bolka back at sea, crew was celebrating, and the beach was quiet once again. Apart from the winds and the torrential rains, East Coast lows and cyclones have another powerful weapon in their armoury, the storm surge.
So in simple terms, a storm surge is when the sea invades the coastline, and it's caused by a combination of factors. Low atmospheric pressure, that leads to a rise in the sea surface. The second is wind, of strong onshore winds piling the water up against the coastline. And on top of that, thirdly, you've got waves. Previously breaking further offshore, now they're breaking on the coastline. And that's where the issues and the damage starts.
The late 60s and 70s were a bad time for the east coast of Australia, as a series of massive lows struck the shoreline. The damage was terrible, right through New South Wales and up into Queensland's Gold Coast. In 2016, Sydney was smashed by the mother of all lows.
That was a big event. There's no question there was significant property loss. The unique thing there was that was a function of an east coast low directing waves in a certain direction. So as it turned out in that event, it was the southern end of some of those Sydney beaches which got damaged the most because they were facing into the east coast low. So they were looking into the teeth of the low system and the storm surge as a result.
The northern beach of Collaroy suffered terribly as houses had no defence against the surging waves. The eastern beaches of Sydney copped a hammering as well.
Historically, more people have died in storm surges than due to the wind effects of tropical cyclones. Fortunately, in Australia, we haven't had too many storm surges have a major impact on a major urban area. But that's only a matter of time, and we will see one hit a major regional town or a capital city, and then we'll really see some real damage done.
There is one weather event that everyone is familiar with, the classic thunderstorm. But a thunderstorm is a complex beast and can come in many different guises.
So we can really have three main types of thunderstorms: single-cell thunderstorms, multi-cell thunderstorms, and we can have supercell thunderstorms. The single-cell one has just got a single zone of updraft and downdraft. Multiple-cell thunderstorm will have multiple cells of updraft. A supercell will be a very well-organised multi-cell thunderstorm that can last for many hours. So you've got a regular inflow of air and moisture and regular outflow, and because it's very well organised, it can get to quite severe intensity.
This is what it's like to be caught in the middle of a severe Sydney supercell, with winds up to 200 kilometres an hour, turning everything into lethal missiles. This is the result of a supercell storm in the Sydney suburb of Cornell.
All the roofs started caving in, so we got under the table, and then all the glass all blew in and smashed everywhere. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever been through. I thought I was going to die.
Homes were literally torn apart. Trucks blown over and debris littering the street. It was part of a series of supercells across Sydney, sending residents scurrying for safety. It brought heavy rains and flash flooding, while lightning split the roof of this home.
I heard a loud noise, like boom.
Crowds at this Bondi shopping centre had to be evacuated as parts of the roof gave way. 500 properties were extensively damaged. Not a cyclone, but try telling that to the homeowners.
So supercell thunderstorms are often going to produce the largest hailstones and the most severe hailstorms. That's because there's a lot of updraft and downdraft up in the clouds in the higher levels of the atmosphere. And so what we're getting is the freezing of water particles until that ice becomes so large that it can no longer be held up there in the cloud and it falls to the ground. And so a very severe hailstorm can cause a tremendous amount of damage.
And this is the result of one of those supercells, a massive hailstorm which smashed into Sydney in 1947.
Hailstones cut a swathe across Sydney one January afternoon. It was one of the worst on record, and in only a few minutes caused more than $1 million worth of damage as thousands of windows and tiles were shattered. Some stones exceeded a pound in weight, one of Sydney's worst icy air raids.
In just a couple of hours, 1,000 people were injured. In 2007, a supercell hit Australia's capital, Canberra, and dumped 39 centimetres of ice on the city, triggering flooding and landslides. In March 2010, 650 kilometres south, the city of Melbourne came off second best from a supercell. When the rain came, it poured, with central Victoria bearing the brunt of it. Flash flooding created rivers in Bendigo. It dumped 19 centimetres of rain in less than half an hour and caused $220 million of damage. 2 weeks later, on the other side of the country, Perth got 1 month's worth of rain in just 7 minutes.
Large hailstones battered the city as lightning lit up the sky. For some, cars provided the only refuge.
But the biggest, baddest supercell of them all was the one that sliced through Sydney in 1999, leaving the country's most damaging natural disaster in its wake. April in Sydney is usually mild, so when radar showed a front coming from the south and storm clouds appearing on the horizon late on Wednesday the 14th, no one gave it a second thought. It started as a spectacular light show. Then came the sound of small hailstones, but that gave way to something else. Sydney-siders knew they were in trouble. Hailstones the size of tennis balls were smashing down at 200 kilometres an hour.
I really thought it was the end of the world.
Just like a hurricane's hit it.
Oh, it's like someone hurling rocks at the wall.
Homes, cars, streets and people were subjected to a relentless barrage of icy missiles. Roof tiles, windows and skylights were no match for the hail. In the 90 minutes it took to cross Sydney, the storm unleashed 500,000 tonnes of hailstones on the city and suburbs.
Look at them! Quick, quick! There's a river of ice!
Emergency services received calls every 10 seconds as roofs were ripped off and houses flooded.
It was one hell of a storm, mate, I'm telling you, I've never seen nothing like it in my life.
The storm's victims were faced with an awful legacy. The scale of the damage was unbelievable, and rescue crews simply couldn't keep up with the demands for help. The final damages bill was $2.7 billion. Australians are used to weathering ferocious thunderstorms. But the one that raced through country Victoria and slammed Melbourne in 2016 was loaded with added, unexpected peril. Within minutes, the entire city was left gasping for air in a mass asthma epidemic. What caused it was a highly unusual phenomenon called thunderstorm asthma. It barreled across Victoria towards a totally unprepared city. Mania Makalani and his cousin Maddox were the first to feel its impact.
Trying to breathe, it was like I was choking. I was really short of breath. I couldn't really talk.
Seeing my cousin like that, like someone in so much pain, like right before my eyes, so I got very, very scared.
Half an hour later, and 30 kilometres to the east, young mother Jackie Falzoni was woken up by an asthma attack.
I thought I was going to die. I was telling my partner I'm going to die.
For the first time in her life, medication was useless.
It just kept on getting worse and worse, and it kept on blocking off my breathing until I couldn't breathe much anymore.
Within 90 minutes, ambulance services were hopelessly overwhelmed. Distress calls were coming in every 4 seconds. Ambulance Victoria's Paul Holman and his response team were blindsided.
The scale of it and the spread of it was something I'd never seen, heard, read about, or even envisaged in our planning.
At one point, the emergency services line was hit with 140 simultaneous code 1s, the most extreme category. 20-year-old law student Hope Carnivale had been a severe asthma sufferer all her life. When the storm hit the outer suburb of Hoppers Crossing, Hope's sister and mother were powerless to help her.
Suddenly it hit her and she could not breathe, she couldn't talk, she couldn't sit up. So then I went over to her and I was helping her. And then Mum got home and we called the ambulance.
How far away is the ambulance? They're coming lights and sirens as quickly as they can, ma'am, OK?
And it wasn't just asthma patients. People who had never suffered from it were struck down, like the otherwise healthy 11-year-old JL.
Inside, it felt like it was like squeezed together, like really wanting air to come out, but nothing was barely coming out. It was just a really little wheeze, and I was thinking like, what's gonna happen? Am I gonna die?
When Rebecca rushed her daughter to the nearest hospital, she found it overrun with people desperate for asthma treatment which had long since been exhausted.
And I looked around me and I just said, what's happening? This must be the end of the world. This must be the last day on Earth.
It wasn't Armageddon, but Melbourne had been hit by a deadly plague of pollen. Ideal growing conditions meant that fields of ryegrass were ripe with pollen, and the ferocious winds had sucked thousands of tonnes into the gathering storm front. Normally, ryegrass pollen is too large to enter the airways and spark an asthma attack. But this megastorm was different. It was highly charged and heavy with moisture. Those two factors caused millions of large pollen particles to explode, scattering trillions of microscopic specks over the city and deep into the lungs of everyone who breathed them in. Amongst those struggling to breathe was Mania, who knew he was in deep trouble.
I thought it was over. Yeah, I didn't know what to do.
Mania's cousin Maddox rang for an ambulance, and he was lucky. His call was answered. Paramedics Anita and Georgie were dispatched and made it with minutes to spare.
He couldn't speak. He was so unwell that he couldn't speak. He was only answering my questions with a nod. He was so unwell that it was likely that we were going to lose him. Normally, we'd hopefully have 3 or 4 of us to manage a patient that was that unwell. But on that night, we just had to manage just the 2 of us.
Meanwhile, Hope Carnivale's family was still desperately waiting for an ambulance.
We carried her outside and she was just on my shoulder. And then at that point, she started crying and telling me that she was scared. And that's when it really hit me. And I started to get emotional and I started crying. We're just crying with each other. And then I kind of realised that I might lose.
Hope's family had been waiting for over 30 minutes for an ambulance that would never arrive.
We heard sirens, but that unfortunately was for a house just behind us. And then probably about 2 minutes after we heard that siren, we couldn't feel a pulse. Had I been told that an ambulance wasn't in the vicinity, it wasn't dispatched, they had none left, I would have put her in that car in a heartbeat and I would have had her at that hospital.
Hope Carnivale was one of the 9 people who lost their lives that day.
I love you so much.
As a result of the asthma storm that hit Melbourne on November 21st, 8,500 people were treated by the city's health services. According to scientists, there will be a next time. From the days of Cyclone Mahina, when hundreds perished at sea, the waters around Australia have been home to incredible rescues and terrible tragedies. In 1992, off Yamba in New South Wales, this 9-metre yacht was struck by a massive storm and rolled several times, destroying the boom and blowing out the windows. When she began taking on water through the cracks in the hull, concern for the crew turned to fear as rescue was put on hold because of the weather. Eventually, rescuers arrived, with crewmen battling 7-metre swells to reach the yacht.
Conditions were pretty uncomfortable out there today, and the people were a bit panicky. They weren't very happy about being on board. They wanted to get out and get winched up and get back to safety.
Thanks to the rescue effort, this time everyone made it home. Sailing from Cairns to South Africa was the trip of a lifetime for 2 Aussie adventurers, Helen and Robert Holt. But it almost killed them.
We were knocked down. Actually, this is what I wrote down here, knocked down. That was our position down there. Approximately 200 nautical miles.
The winds began to rise without warning. By 7 that night, it was blowing a 50-knot gale. By the next day, it was roaring at 70 knots.
The seas at that stage were foam. There were breaking crests from what little we could see, which was very little, and the wind, and it was still increasing. The wind was still increasing.
At 5:30 a.m. on Saturday, they were waiting for the morning light when a massive wave drove their 16-ton yacht deep underwater.
We heard a roar, a large roar, and then all I've termed it as is a sledgehammer. A huge bang hit us, and all I saw was blackness. It felt as though she was a piece of paper, flipping over a piece of paper like a page on a notebook or something. It was incredibly fast.
Miraculously, she came back up, but Robert found Helen unconscious on the cabin floor.
I couldn't detect any breathing. I gave her a few whacks in the chest, in the middle of the chest, started to apply CPR.
We're so grateful to be alive.
Robert had been sending out distress signals, and finally a plane and frigate arrived. After many tries, a tow rope was attached in an attempt to save their boat, but it wasn't to be.
The captain, he said, "I've been instructed by Canberra to drop the tow and take you on board."
Frenchman Thierry Dubois and British-born Tony Bullimore were taking part in a round-the-world solo yacht race in 1997 when they were both swept deep into the Antarctic Ocean by enormous waves and non-stop gales. They became the subject of a massive search and rescue mission by the Royal Australian Air Force.
We've never had a rescue so far south. It's closer to Antarctica. And it'll be really stretching all the resources for this one.
The frigate HMAS Adelaide was deployed to the area as the rescue mothership. After flying 3,000 kilometres over the wildest ocean in the world, one of the spotter planes located Dubois.
Contact, Taco Enter, it's contact. Okay, the survivors on the yacht. Stand by on top. Stand by on the drop.
The Frenchman had somehow managed to cling to the hull of his upturned ocean racer in huge seas and freezing winds. But there was trouble with the life raft drops. 4 life rafts had been dropped until Dubois was finally able to scramble aboard one to relative safety. Meanwhile, the upturned yacht of second missing sailor Tony Bullimore was located and the rescue mission swung into action.
Yeah, it's almost nil in there.
There he is, straight ahead.
A weak emergency alarm raised hopes that he was alive under the hull.
Bullimore's been found in the hull of the yacht and he's alive. Should be okay. They'll get him on Adelaide pretty soon. Yeah.
For the men at search headquarters, the relief after 5 days and nights of searching was overwhelming.
They've just found the Englishman.
That's bloody amazing.
A Navy lifeboat races to the yacht with the rescuers pounding on the hull, and suddenly at the other end of the boat, Tony Bullimore emerges.
He's alive. He's getting in the boat. He's there. That's him. I got him. That's him.
The Navy diver leaps into the water, and within seconds, Bullimore is lifted on board, safe at last. And he wasn't afraid to show his gratitude.
Yeah, it was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. The banging on the side of the hull, which was an illogical banging, a big heavy banging, it was like heaven. It was like heaven, and I actually heard a voice outside, and then I started shouting, "I'm coming, I'm coming, I'm coming," and it took me seconds to get from one end of the boat to the other. And then a few deep breaths, I dived out the boat and over. And boy, when I saw this ship standing there and a plane going over the top and a couple of guys, you know, peering over the top of the upturned hull, it was heaven.
How he survived 5 days was a miracle. When the yacht flipped in the enormous seas, he was trapped in a 1.6 metre high air pocket. The experienced sailor had rigged a hammock to keep him just above the water, with air coming through a tiny hole in the hull. He survived on a bottle of water and some chocolate. And news of the rescue shot around the world.
Tony Bullimore was heading for dry land in an Australian frigate today.
A daring, dangerous and remarkable story of an ocean rescue down under.
Sauvé, un seul mot. Thierry Dubois et l'anglais Tony...
Back home in England, Mr. Bullimore's wife, Layla, got the news from hundreds of well-wishers camped on her doorstep.
We hug, we kiss, we jump, we shout. You're wonderful. We open a bottle of champagne and we drink and we shout and we scream and we say, he's alive, he's alive.
In Australia, 2017 had been a quiet year for cyclones. Queensland had had a relatively peaceful summer and autumn was just kicking off. But March 28th brought a nasty surprise. Tropical cyclone Debbie is tracking towards the coast and growing rapidly. It's predicted to hit as a Category 4, with winds up to 240 kilometres per hour. Authorities didn't hesitate to act, evacuating 5,000 people and issuing dire warnings.
Make sure you do your last-minute preparations. This cyclone will have a big impact.
You could say that Debbie's probably the most significant tropical cyclone since Yasi.
With Yasi still fresh in the nation's memory, troops were deployed, property was secured, and the community braced itself for the worst. Just after midday, Debbie struck the coast at Airlie Beach and the Whitsunday Islands.
Yeah, you can feel that gust. You know, that has to be up to 100 k's an hour now.
We're going to remain behind the shelter of the concrete wall here. The brick wall will have a sneaky peek around the side here and have a look at this. This is the absolute power of a cyclone in full flight.
The winds are insane. I can't imagine it getting any worse than this. All the trees are destroyed. It looks like World War III, mate.
That actually, we heard it rip off our roof, so that bit's come off. And a couple of those roofs in the front have lost their flashing and their roofs are starting to lift as well.
Trying to get back into safety. It's too dangerous out here now. Way too dangerous.
The cyclone was going through what we call an eye wall replacement cycle, which means it starts to intensify and then weakens a bit and then starts to intensify again. Whilst it was doing this, some of the islands just offshore in the Whitsundays were being impacted.
Luxury yachts were ripped from their moorings as 260 km/h winds battered the area. Further south in Mackay, a massive storm surge was smashing the coast on the back of a high tide. The cyclone destroyed buildings and blanketed the town in a sea of foam. But Bowen was where Debbie showed her true colours.
Outside, it's blowing real hard. There's trees and branches coming down.
Bowen was a war zone. Debbie was taking out trees, power lines, blocking roads, tearing homes apart and smashing businesses. Making matters worse, Debbie was crawling along at an agonising 12 km/h, subjecting towns to a prolonged onslaught. As Debbie weakened, she tracked south to New South Wales and merged with a cold front. The resulting floods were catastrophic and the cause of many deaths, including, tragically, 3 members of one family swept into the Tweed River. In the end, Debbie's rampage was responsible for 14 deaths overall and $2.4 billion worth of damage. As for the future, it's looking grim, according to the weather experts and climatologists. As the climate warms and greenhouse gases kick in, the number of intense thunderstorm days in Australia is expected to increase. Storm surges are expected to worsen as they are now riding on rising sea levels of 3.4 millimetres per year.
The coast of the future has the real potential for being a different landscape that we're familiar with. And with sea level rise, global warming, that there's the real risk that storm surges will reach higher and further inland.
Our best defence is to be clear-eyed about the future. That means ensuring our infrastructure is prepared, our emergency services are ready, and our communities are aware of what's headed our way.